Hello and happy Friday. So, as you know, we're digging into the French Revolution and we're currently working on analyzing the long term and short term causes of the revolution. Before we move on to actually getting into the first phase of the revolution, we want to stick with analysis of causes and add a little bit more complexity to how historians understand the causes of the revolution, not from a chronological perspective, but from a human perspective, from the perspective of the various social groups or social classes that were contributing to the overthrow of French absolutism. So, before we go any further with that, just a little reminder about what's on for the weekend, due on Monday, McKay, 6:31 to 6:34. Okay, if you need to, grab your workbooks and turn back to page 87, the chart on the causes of the French Revolution, and I'll meet you right back here to tackle those short-term causes. Okay, so now that we've looked at a DBQ, a set of documents on the short-term causes of the revolution, let's make sure we have some key things down and we could take some notes on page 87. So here's those short-term causes in brief. Number one, a financial crisis. So this is kind of as a result of the long-term causes in the 100 years of mercantilist wars, especially between France and Britain. France finds itself on the eve of a financial collapse. So the cost of those mercantilist wars was extremely high, particularly this final round of mercantilist wars, the 7 Years' War. And the Treaty of Paris that ends the 7 Years' War is certainly not friendly towards France at all. It's definitely a win for Britain. And so finalizing this standoff between France and Britain is France's participation in the American Revolution. Obviously, from your previous studies, I think, the Americans were revolting against the British, trying to establish an independent government, and the French were all there for that because they really wanted to try to weaken the British mercantilist empire. So they go funding the American Revolution, and sure enough, the Americans get their independence, but that doesn't really financially do anything for the French state. It really just leads them deeper into bankruptcy. A second short-term cause is the nature of leadership at the time. So the French were increasingly perceiving their leaders as weak, especially the Bourbon monarchs. Under Louis XV, there's what's known as the desacralization of the monarchy. So this is the reading revolution, which included not only people reading literature and the Bible, but also short pamphlets and more or less tabloids. And these tabloids are starting to really smear the reputation of the monarchs, especially the very luxurious lifestyle of Louis XV. And Louis XVI comes to the throne at an extremely young age as a teenager, married to Marie Antoinette, one of the daughters of Maria Theresa. And the public perception of these two is not only that they're young, but they're extremely incapable and extremely out of touch with a rapidly changing 18th century society. So that's not really working for them in the case of rising concerns about finances and bankruptcy and the Enlightenment. So the third short-term cause, popular revolts. Anytime a revolution starts in history, there is an element of just bad luck and bad timing. And boy, was it really bad timing for a famine. While this tension is mounting and while the government is going bankrupt, the economy as a whole is in a big slump because of a massive famine in 1787. So really on the eve of the French Revolution. And one small example of this, and we'll look at a little bit more data in a second, is that in 1787, between 1787 and 1788, bread prices rise by 67%. And for people that are just living at the subsistence level or barely above the subsistence level, this is a really life-changing inflation of bread prices that sinks a lot of people into dire poverty. And it's starting to cause bread riots and an increasing suspicion that these problems with famines and this problem of the shortage of bread is being caused on purpose by the king. Finally, there's a taxation crisis. Obviously, the French state, is in dire financial straits, and they can't ask people for more money because they can barely afford the price of bread. So Louis XVI and his finance minister, Necker, start to do the right thing. They start to propose reforms to the taxation system because they know they need to increase the revenue of the state. But not surprisingly, all tax reforms that they propose to local governments are rejected. It has to be the local governments or the local parliaments that accept this law or a new taxation policy and impose it on their region of France. And they reject it. They don't want to impose new taxes on people. So Louis XVI does something that on the surface seems like a great move, the move of a good leader, but it ends up kind of being a really dumb move. He starts to go about asking regions, asking parliaments to collect what are called cahiers. Cahiers are literally the word for notebooks. And these notebooks are supposed to collect the grievances of the French people at this very precocious time. And he ends up calling the Estates General, which we're going to come back to in a moment. So we're just about ready to start the revolution. But before we do, we want to look at the short-term causes from a different angle, from a slightly more in-depth angle. Here's a little bit of data before we do that different angle first in terms of government expenditures in 1788. There is this popular perception that a lot of government expenditure was because of the court or the Palace of Versailles. But notice that, while significant, in terms of the total expenditures of the state, Versailles really wasn't a very significant amount of the whole expenditure. But at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter if popular perception believes that it is. And of course, the French Revolution is a popular revolt. Now, Personal Finance 101. When you spend expenditure more than you make in your income, that means debt. And when most of the income that you're taking in is just going off to paying the interest on your debts, and you can barely spend the rest on just the functions of your life, or in this case, the functions of the state, your state's going to collapse. So that's a bad sign. Here's a little bit of the effect of those rising bread prices. The proportion of a person's wages that an urban worker has to spend to buy bread. In 1788, it rises to 50%, and by July of 1789, once the French Revolution starts, 75%. So this is a really lowering standard of living for most people in the 18th century. A little bit more specific data about that, broken down by occupation, right? So how much of a person's daily wage is being spent on bread between August of 1788 and between February and July of 1789. Significant increases amongst all classes. Yeah. Regardless if you've got specialized skill. Here's an example of a thesis that you might have written for that DBQ about the short-term causes of the French Revolution, looking at causes from a chronological perspective. So as you can see, it first addresses long-term causes. The long-term causes of the French Revolution lie in the socioeconomic and intellectual changes of the 18th century, Industrious Revolution and Enlightenment, and that made France's political system increasingly obsolete. The short-term causes were all tied to compounding economic crisis stemming from mercantilist policy, or really failed mercantilist policy, that left the government bankrupt and unable to address popular revolts triggered by famine. This very perfect storm that all comes together in 1788, 1789. Okay, so the final thing we're going to look at before we dig into the first phase of the revolution is another angle that historians put on causes. So we can certainly ask the question, why did the French Revolution start? When did the French Revolution start? When it did, in both the short term and the long term. But another interesting question is, from whom did the French Revolution start? The revolution was many things to many people, and that's why there's truly multiple revolutions going on. So we can better understand how the revolution unfolds and the structure of its many phases by looking at the different interest groups of people that were pro-revolutionary. And that includes some of the aristocracy and what's going on with changes to their lives. It certainly has a lot to do with this rising class of merchants or merchant capitalists, the bourgeoisie, and this class that's relatively new in European history, the proletarianization of agricultural work that led to wage labor that's both rural and urban. So before we move forward, here's what I'm going to have you guys do. On pages 94 and 95, you've got two sources in your workbook. On page 94, we've got a source that represents a much more traditional argument about the question, who started the French Revolution? So you're going to split up. Half of your group, two of you, or maybe just one of you if you're in a group of three, is going to read this traditional argument on page 94 and answer the questions that follow. The other half of your group, the other one or two of you, is going to read the revisionist argument, the newer historical argument on page 95, and answer the questions that follow. Once both sides of your table are done, exchange answers. And hopefully you can understand this difference in historiography, the different arguments about who started the French Revolution and why. Okay, we're going to stop here for now. Go ahead, pages 94 and 95. And when you're done with that work, I've got another video that'll help us get started in the first liberal phase of the French Revolution.